to say thanks to Capital Farm Credit for providing our coffee and our donuts. I'm going to introduce Donna Hughes in just a little while. Donna is with StoneX, and she's back there visiting with Kelly Giles right now. StoneX is going to be the sponsor for our lunch, and Donna will be our keynote speaker right after lunch. I want to encourage you during our breaks to make your way back to her table and get acquainted with her. I really appreciate it. I also want to mention that North Plains Electric Cooperative is the sponsor of Dr. Benavidez's talk today. So North Plains Electric provides us our electricity through this part of northeast Texas Panhandle region and area. So I want to thank Randy Bohannon and the crew there for their participation with us today. Again, I want to say Dr. Benavidez is an outstanding authority. He and Dr. Smith are working on these decision aids he's going to tell you a lot about here just in a moment. I want to share this with you too. These guys are busy, but they're never too busy to help people. So if you need specific individual assistance with your ranching program, guys, they're great resources. So help me welcome again Dr. Justin Benavidez.
Thank you all very much. Always a treat to come up here to this part of the country, and Andy always sets me up a little bit too well. I prefer to under-promise and over-deliver, so hopefully this goes all right now. And Andy actually did a really good job of setting up what I'm going to talk about today. I think, if anything, actually, which is nothing, this is something I've never said about Andy, I think he undersold the potential in the cattle market a little bit in the next couple of years. I think that when we're talking about $2,000 heifers, I'm thinking we're going to be closer to 3 by the end of this drought cycle, to be honest with everybody in the room. Y'all can write that down and tell me I was wrong later on. But we're going to talk about putting data to some of the things that Andy has already mentioned today. And I'll point out too, I don't know if Jason's in the room, I don't see him, but Andy mentioned that, we're willing to come out and help you guys one-on-one, and I'm speaking a little bit for Jason and myself, but there's a lot of those technologies that we're going to talk about, some opportunities for some premium marketing and some backgrounding that you can do with your calves, where if you don't have the skill set and you don't have the labor available to help you with that kind of, if we're talking about implants or dehorning or those kinds of activities, we're willing to come out and help. I mean, Jason is the expert. I'll hold the tools, whatever we need to do, right? I just do the numbers, but we're both willing to come out and come to y'all's ranch just to visit, but also to help you work and learn these things. That's what we're here to do. So please, as Andy said, please do let us know. We're happy to come out. Both of us, I think I can say, would prefer to come talk to producers one-on-one on the ranch or the farm more than about anything else. So we'll dive in and go ahead. I'm going to try to get us out of here in about, or not out of here, but I'll try to wrap up about 10 after. And in that time, what we're going to do, I just turned it off. There we go. I'm going to talk about the state of the economy, because the overarching economy builds a lot of what our meat consumption is doing. I'm going to talk about what the beef market is doing, kind of in response to the economy and in response to the cattle market. So from the supply side, as well as from the demand side, talking about the economy on one end with consumer behavior, and then the supply side with all of the factors that we all hear about every day. I'm going to talk about the drought and those market dynamics that are influencing supply and how they interact to give us what I do think is going to be, as Andy has already mentioned, maybe some record-breaking cattle prices. And then we'll talk about some options. So Andy mentioned decision tools. We're going to go through what our options are for some weaned calf opportunities, maybe some changes to that production plan, and what the potential revenue streams are there. And then we'll talk about what to do with cows if you haven't culled already, and what some opportunities are if you have culled and maybe you have a little bit of cash in your pocket from that sale. What some opportunities are to, again, access some premiums while the cattle market is in kind of a unique setting right now. And then we're going to spend some of the time at the end of the presentation talking in depth about those decision tools. They're going to help you analyze those choices, because what's really important is using your own data and trying to figure out what's best for your operation. We've got a vast array of decision tools. I counted them up today roughly, and across the animal science department and agricultural economics department, we have roughly 150 different decision tools that help you all the way from specific enterprise choices. So what do I need to supplement? with, all the way up to an overarching cow-calf and stalker profitability tool that you can all plug together to evaluate a bunch of our decisions. So we'll talk about those at the end. So diving into the economy, this is one of the more confusing macroeconomic situations we've seen ourselves in a long time. What you see there on the left-hand side is quarterly GDP. So this is the change from the previous quarter. So to keep in mind, whenever you hear on the news that GDP is down, this doesn't mean we are in negative GDP, right? This means that GDP growth is less than the previous quarter, because if we look at this, it's changed from previous quarter, so that's real dollar change. So we didn't necessarily see negative GDP. What we saw was a decline compared to that previous quarter. Now, I'm not saying that that means we're in a positive growth setting. What I would like to point out, though, is we've had record-breaking levels of GDP change from quarter to quarter since COVID-19, and that's a function of how much we contracted. But what I want to kind of point out is that the economy is not necessarily in the worst or the most negative situation that we hear about out in the news, because people tend to misinterpret GDP data. We are seeing a bit of a slowdown compared to these levels that we're seeing. You know, we're probably at about 2% month to or quarter to quarter change over the previous quarter. We did slow down, but we're not in a negative setting. We are not yet in a recession, and that's why you see everyone using the words cool down, and you see everyone using the word slow down and not using recession, because we have not reached a recession yet. And I'm not personally entirely sure on the macroeconomic side if we're going to hit a recession. There's potential there for it to happen, but I just want to point out that when you hear all these confusing signals and all these confusing notes about the economy slowing down, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're in a recession. And once you realize that growth is still in the positive setting, it just is negative month to month or quarter to quarter in terms of how it moved, that kind of makes a little bit more clarity available in the overall economic situation. So right, we've got very low unemployment, so this has returned to pre-pandemic levels. Some of the lowest unemployment in history. That's really positive. So we want to start thinking about this in terms of how much money people have in their pockets to buy goods and services, and in our case, right, beef. Low unemployment is very positive for meat purchases, and in particular for beef. We are at the strongest U.S. dollar value since 2002. The index is currently at 108 compared to 118 in 2002. That means the demand for U.S. dollars is very strong. So the rest of the world sees our currency as a reserve currency in a very positive light right now. That means, oh, I got a question back here.
Since you're on now already, and so I follow the currency trade, not much don't, for sure. But every currency in the world, except for I don't follow the yuan or the ruble. The ruble's only worth a penny and a half to a dollar. But anyway, we're seeing a tremendous spread or loss. In other words, yeah, the dollar's gained tremendously in value, but it's all about relationship to other currencies.
Absolutely.
So the other currencies have been losing, especially the euro, even the pound. Everything's losing ground. And so I have to ask the question, in your opinion, why are we seeing that?
Why are we seeing losses in the other currencies as opposed to our currency?
Spread. Why is the dollar gaining so strong?
Yeah, so I think it's that the rest of the world views the United States as our strong reserve currency. We have been the reserve currency for the globe for decades, and I think that in terms of security on the macroeconomic level, though I understand that we do have some sensitive economic conditions right now, we're still the strongest economy on the planet. Particularly, Don and I were talking about prior to the program this morning. We're seeing some COVID lockdowns in China. We're seeing a resurgence of COVID in some other countries. The war in Ukraine and Russia. Some of our stronger economies around the globe are the ones that are feeling the pressure, and that's why dollars are fleeing to the U.S. Or I guess currency expenditures are fleeing to the U.S. and they have to come from somewhere, and so they're leaving those other currencies and largely coming to the U.S. dollar.
And today, banks, we just renewed our operating loan recently, and now it used to be that the loan shall be repaid in U.S. dollars. Doesn't say that anymore. It says the loan shall be repaid in whatever currencies used by the Federal Reserve Bank.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Are you thinking electronic, Bitcoin or something, or what are they saying?
Probably some kind of digital.
Yeah, some kind of digital.
Interesting. I hadn't seen that yet. That's interesting.
That's what's so
So in general, what I'd like to, all I want to take away from this slide is that at large, we do see that the economic signals are strong, but there are some headwinds out there. The inflationary pressure that we're seeing in most goods and services is leading to a net decline in real disposable income, right? And so people, though we have more dollars, the real value of those dollars has declined, largely because of the inflationary pressure that no one has missed that, I'm sure. So what does all this mean for beef and meat in general? Well, if we look at the consumer price index over the last, we've got our 5-year average, we've got our 2021 series, and then we've got our 2022 series. You can see that obviously the value of meats in general, so this includes meats and poultry, has increased year over year compared to that previous 5-year average. And anytime we see an increase in the value of these without a corresponding increase in supply, right, that means that every pound of product is going to be more expensive. And there's some pressure coming from the demand pull side, but also some pressure coming from the supply push side. We are losing more of the cattle herd. We are beginning to see a lot of signals that are telling us that the packers do not have enough to run at full capacity, even if they've got a full labor force. And so what all of this means is that we want to look at how much people are paying for meat and then how much they are eating or consuming, or how much disappearance we have coupled together to look at some function of demand. So this is meat as a whole. We've got beef and veal, uncooked ground beef, and chicken. I've got pulled those numbers specifically for us to think about. Beef and veal was leading the charge overall in terms of the change in its value month to month, but recently that has slowed down, and beef and veal now is up about 3.4% compared to a year ago. Uncooked ground beef, though, up 9.7%, right? We talked about earlier a change in real disposable income or falling per capita disposable income. What do people do as soon as they begin to see a pressure on their real dollars they're able to spend? They can stop buying durable goods, right? So that's very important for the cotton market. The next thing they begin to do is start changing some of their purchasing patterns for what they have to buy, right? So you have to eat, but instead of buying the steak, you're gonna buy the ground beef. Instead of buying beef, in some cases, people will deviate to poultry. However, what we're seeing is that because of some of those high path issues, high pathogenic avian influenza, the price of chicken and poultry in general has skyrocketed. So in the last month, it actually made up a much larger change in the overall value of meats. And so it's outpacing, it's well above the change in value for beef and veal and uncooked ground beef. So this is going to be very important for the cow market. It's going to explain a lot of what we're seeing in the cow market, but then also this beef and veal percent change in price is going to explain some of the changes we're seeing in the calf market, though I think more of what's leading the calf market is the supply issues. I saw a question back here.
Are you seeing something similar in the pork industry as far as protein?
Pork's about middle of the road, so it's I think the July data said it was in the neighborhood of 3 to 4%, roughly the same as that beef and veal cuts. And I don't know as much about the pork dynamics that have led to the inflation there, other than, again, for a while people just had a lot of disposable income in their pockets as a function of those COVID adjustments, and so that was a lot of demand pull pressure on pork. I expect some of that to be liquidated very soon from both beef and pork. So some of that also, we see this increase in the price of chicken. That's people leaving those other cuts and going back to chicken, which is pulling the price of chicken up, making beef more competitive again. So it's this long-term running cycle of supply and demand interacting to get some kind of equilibrium. So all of that is the meat complex in general. Again, we've got people deviating to lower value cuts out of our higher value cuts and different species, so different kinds of protein rather than beef. But what I would like for you to take away, this does show that people are deviating to some lower value product and to some poultry. But again, what I'd like to point out, as I just said, in that supply-demand balance, people are still paying more for beef and veal, and what we'll see here pretty quick is that demand for beef overall is very strong, some of the strongest beef demand we've ever seen. If we look at this retail fresh beef demand index, This is compared to the 2000 levels. So we set a base level there at 100, and then changes year to year show us what the demand is for beef. So this is a construction developed of how much we're paying and how much we're consuming. So a lot of it is kind of driven by how much beef we have in the market, so just disappearance in general. We don't actually know what the average consumption is per capita. We just know how much beef we produce and how many people there are in the US. So that's why it kind of has that same cyclical movement that you see in a beef or a cattle inventory chart. But what you can see is that let's leave COVID-19 and those years after COVID-19 out. We were already in a very strong beef demand market, right? So higher than the historic average since the index began, 112, 111, 108, 105, 106. This is largely a function of lower supply because we did have some liquidation. We were in the rebuilding phase right here. But even though we had low supply, people were paying enough that the combination of those two factors had us at very strong demand. We get out here to COVID-19, we didn't start losing calves out of the herd. We haven't actually seen a net decline in the calf herd quite until this year. So these 2 years right here, some of that is some COVID-induced market changes, but we still saw an increase in the overall beef demand index, largely as a function of the fact that people are willing to pay more for these premium products. And you think about when the beef quality audit first began in the mid-2000s and what that's done for the quality of our product and the ability for you to go out to, you know, a Wednesday night meal and get a really good quality steak as opposed to that having to be only your Saturday night meal or maybe your once a month meal. That means that the demand overall for beef, even though some of those higher value products might have been pulled down by the oversupply, overall that has been very positive for the beef industry. And that's why we're seeing people move more and more into beef as a regular alternative for those high value cuts rather than poultry or pork, because it is high quality. And in some of the same cases, we've seen some loss in the quality of pork, right? So we talk about some of the flavor losses in the American pork chop and all that stuff. So very strong. And if we look at where this is heading, on the demand pull side, this is on its own a very strong signal for the price of calves going forward, because people want our product, they want that high quality, and they want to continue purchasing even though prices are high. But we've got to think about what the different types of market segmentation are for different kinds of cuts. So I've got the beef rib primal here. The value, again, any of the charts you see like this, that's going to be the 5-year average in red, the 2021 value listed there in the blue dot, and then the solid blue line is going to be 2022. You can see that we had spikes in the value of the rib well above the 5-year historic average, but now over 2022, the beef primal has largely, the beef rib primal has largely flattened out. And so that's a function, again, of people beginning to pull back from some of those high value cuts, a loss in real expenditures power, so loss in, even though their dollars may be more, the cost of goods has gone up so much that their ability to purchase more of this has kind of stayed the same or gone negative. And so pretty solid flattening out in the value of the beef primal, and that's a function of people moving to those lower value cuts. Where do we see that becoming apparent? This is the wholesale boneless beef, quote unquote primal at fresh 90% lean. You can see that we had a decline from the values last year and have stayed flat through 22. We've stayed flat through 22 on boneless beef as well, but it's remained high at the level that we saw in 2021. That's as people have begun to lose spending power, lose real dollars available to purchase goods. They're deviating back to spending that dollar on a product they can get more of. And so rather than buying a steak, they're buying a pound of ground beef where you can make an entire, meal of hamburger helper for a family of 3, or for 2 pounds, maybe a family of 5, as opposed to 5 steaks or something like that, right? So beef is still the center of the plate, but they're moving to different kinds of cuts. And so we're moving into that lower value cut. And remember this chart whenever we think about the cull cow market, right? Where do we get all of our boneless beef from? Largely from the cull cow market. And so this is going to be very important as we go forward into the next couple of years, thinking about where the value of cows stays or moves to, and then the comparative value of retaining those cows versus selling them. So now talking about a little bit more about the drought and where it's left us. I don't know how many of you, I did not realize, frankly, this is the September 1st of 2020 U.S. Drought Monitor. This is the August 31st of 2021 U.S. Drought Monitor, and this is our most recent drought monitor map. I did not quite realize how long the western U.S. had been in a pretty significant drought. I knew it had been a long time. I didn't realize quite the extent that it had endured. And we had some good precipitation last summer that left us in not quite as severe a drought state as we were in 2020, but we've gone back obviously to a very significant state of drought in Texas. And so that's, at one point, more than 60% of the United States was in some stage of drought. And most of that, other than the deep southeast where we've got a lot of cow-calf operations, all of this is cattle and sheep country, right? We've got a lot of cattle, a lot of sheep operations. And so we've seen wide-scale liquidation of the cow herd as well as the sheep herd. And what's important is that we've seen a wide-scale liquidation of the breeding herds, right? Because that takes much longer to replace than the calf herd. So why do I say all of this, and why do I have this up here? First, let's focus on calf prices and cattle inventory. This is cattle inventory in the red bars. This is calf price in Kansas, which is kind of in the middle of the country and it's mostly representative of at least the trend we see in calf prices. What do you notice about the red bars and the blue line? They're moving opposite. There are going to be people on the radio, on TV, in the newspaper, in popular press that tell you that the cattle cycle does not influence prices and that it is not necessarily real, and they're going to tell you that other people are manipulating the market. That may be true on a very small scale day to day in the neighborhood of cents per pound, like single-digit cents per pound. The overarching trends of supply and demand cannot be beat. And this is all the proof you need right here. When supplies are high, prices are low. When supplies are low, prices are high. You cannot beat the forces of supply and demand, no matter how much manipulative power you have, even if you're a monopoly. If people don't want your product, you're not going to be able to mark it up for a high value. So all that to say, the reason I show this, and I'm showing it more and more frequently, is that this entire slide by itself could be the presentation. As supplies go down, we expect prices to go up. And you can see that as supplies went to their lowest, we saw incredible price hikes. So
the cattle inventory, I mean, look at the left side of the chart compared to this. So we've reached peak inventory even though we didn't get near what we were in the 90s?
say that again, I'm sorry.
We've reached our peak inventory even though we didn't get near where we were in the 90s?
Yes, I think so, and that's a really good point that I'm going to get to here in just a second because it is very important for what we're talking about in terms of $2,000 or $3,000. Okay. So let's think about where that drought was. This is when Texas was in more than 80% of drought. More than 80% of Texas was in drought according to the Drought Monitor. And again, this is when we've crossed that threshold. So anytime that Texas was in, oh yeah, good deal. So anytime Texas in the last 12 years was anytime 80% of Texas was in more than D1 drought, I've got that highlighted here. So to your point, we were already prior to the last drought at higher cattle inventory than we ever got back to here. So what does that mean? Right now we do have more beef per animal, but the population of the U.S. is higher and supplies are going to be tighter than they were. So then that's when we start getting to talking about in economics what we call elasticities, and I promise not to harp on this too much because it's economics and it's boring. But what we expect is that as we get tighter and tighter and tighter supplies, the price swings in response should be larger and larger, right? Because eventually we're going to make some thresholds where people realize I can't get beef where I need it to be on the timeline that I need it there. And so the bids begin to get larger and larger because we saw that demand is good, but supplies are going to be at some of their lowest levels of all time. Yes, sir.
Three little items here. Number one, you mentioned that families are choosing the lower cost product.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good enough. So what are like two things that are driving that disposable income? What's eating up their disposable income?
It's largely inflation.
So inflation, which fuel would be part of that. The higher fuel goes, the higher inflation goes. The higher inflation goes, the higher fuel goes. So it's mostly inflation and fuel.
Mm-hmm.
That was it?
That was only 2 things.
Yeah, I'm like Rick Barry. Those 3 things, that's it.
That was good.
Yeah, that was,
Excellent. Yeah, so that is driving a lot of those prices. But the point I want to make again is what Andy said earlier. This shows exactly what he said, right? The opportunity is going to come soon. And so when you're thinking about what to do with what your production decisions are, it's very important to realize that in the next year, if not the next 2 years, we should probably see record-breaking calf prices again. I think it is very likely that we'll see record-breaking cattle prices. Right, so just keep in mind, well, I'm not saying $1.03, this $2.50 over here. And we're already in some cases selling $2.37, $2.38 that I saw on the auction report just this week. So I haven't done a comprehensive review, but just this week we sold some 237s and 238s for some 6 weights in Tulia. So what does this mean for the total inventory in general? So you can see the inventory is going down. That's through 21. We're actually lower than we were in 21. We got the July cattle inventory. We're down 2% when we compare that to the previous July. So a substantial loss. This is not quite as big as the losses that we saw in the 2012 liquidation, but we do have fewer cows now. And so again, that magnitude of the price change we expect to see is going to be higher. Fewer cows, so this is all cattle inventory. It's largely composed of the loss of cows, which was a loss of 2%, and that's just beef cows. This is dairy and beef cattle inventory, but right here, this loss of 2% is just in the beef cow herd. So a lot of cattle lost. The drought is not over. There's nothing saying that we're gonna start building the herd back yet, even with good prices, because if you don't have grass, there's not much you can do, right? Because corn's expensive right now too. So where are the cattle going? This is total cow slaughter. So you got that 5-year, 21, and then solid line is 22. We can see that cow slaughter, this is beef and dairy, is at record levels. We're killing more cows every week than we have historically for that particular week in a very long time, if not ever, depending on the week. So record-breaking cow slaughter, largely being driven by beef cow slaughter. Again, we saw that 2% decline in beef cow inventory. That is all being shown here. You can see we're at record-breaking levels of beef cow slaughter, and that's largely from liquidations. This was all Western liquidation. This is now largely Southern Plains liquidation, where we're losing those beef cows on the Southern Plains. Why does this matter? They are the productive engine of the beef cow herd, of the beef industry. And so to think about this kind of sequentially, if we've got a beef cow that we liquidate in a normal price cycle, a normal inventory cycle, that means that she's leaving as a function of what the market signals are saying, so we don't really need her. If we're liquidating her because of drought, we may still actually need that cow unit. And so in order to replace back the cows that we need, if we liquidate a cow, we first have to have it start raining. We then have to retain a heifer to where she is at breeding age. We then have to breed. We then have to have that calf gestate for 283 days and then reach 18 to 24 months before it's ready for harvest. So what I'm saying is, even if it started raining across the state and across the Southern Plains today, we are at a 3 to 4 year rebuilding pattern before we get back to where the calf supply was last year and or this year, which is a strong signal for prices. Yes, sir?
I thought of my third thing.
Uh-oh.
So, we talked about our U.S. inventory, that's cool. And how many cattle will be moving into feed yards. What about the imports from Mexico?
We're going to get there.
Okay.
I promise. It's a good third thing, though.
Yeah.
You're outpacing me. That's the problem. Okay, so beef cow slaughter, again, very high. What's our other option here? To retain heifers. So what do we think is happening? We're not retaining heifers, right? We're slaughtering heifers left and right. We have had record-breaking heifer slaughter over the period of 21. And again, we're liquidating out of the West in 21, liquidating out of the Southern Plains in 22. And so no cows, no heifers as replacements means that we are losing the productive engine overall, which is a substantial delay in our herd rebuilding cycle, which means we expect 1 to 2 years before we get back to a normal rebuild, which it extends to a 3 to 4 year pattern before we get back to prices like last year, if not longer. It has to start raining first. And what that shows us here is that we actually lost 3% of the heifers that are normally held as beef cow replacements. You can see that is the largest loss since the drought began in the early 2010s, and it's the second largest loss of replacement heifers in history. So again, losing the productive engine overall, which as much as it is a struggle for the industry, that is very positive for prices if you're able to retain any cows or heifers and or use them to generate that productive calf at the end that's going to be much higher value. Cattle on feed, similar signals. We are going to eventually cross these lines. When we start seeing the lines switch place where the blue is below the dotted blue, that means the trend is reversing. I thought it was going to be in August. If it's not in September that we had lower cattle on feed in August, I'm going to be shocked. The placements were roughly equal to a year before, but we're moving kind of contra-seasonally. What I think is happening is that we're pulling so many cattle at lighter weights, and if you look at slaughter weights, they're lower. We're pulling a lighter weight cattle into the processing sector, and because of the drought-induced placements that are higher than normal, we've got more cattle on feed than I would have expected at this time of the year. But at some point, I think in September, we're going to be pulling cattle out of the feed yard faster than we're putting them in. And some of this has been delayed because of all that COVID disruption, even still now 2 years later. And so when cattle on feed begin to switch and we have fewer and fewer cattle on feed, that's whenever we start seeing those packing houses begin to bid up the value of those calves really fast. Again, another signal, steer slaughter. Remember when I said when these lines begin to switch places, that's when you know the trend reversal is here. All of these are in line with each other. We're actually below the 5-year average in a lot of cases. The trend is reversing, and with lower steer slaughter, we expect higher value, particularly with high demand for beef. And so again, we can expect this to induce very strong calf prices in the near future. So what does that mean for all of our options, right? We're going to talk about specific prices here in a second, but what you need to know from that entire 10 slides or 15 slides is lower inventory and higher prices, and we'll talk about specific prices in a second. This is GrassCast from the University of Nebraska. It's I would call it a beta testing tool. I'm not sure that it's completely been confirmed yet on its results, but what they're doing here is essentially measuring grassland productivity within different counties and within different pixelated pieces of a range. And so right here I've circled Hemphill in the red circle. And what we look at is the darker the red, the lower the forage productivity when compared to average. The closer to dark blue, the higher the grassland productivity when we compare it to average. So what dark red, or what this kind of lighter shade of red would mean, is that we've lost 30 to 15% of the grassland productivity in that strip. We've gained 15 to 30% of productivity in the grasslands in that strip, 0 to 15% gain here in this lighter blue, and the green would be roughly equal. And so what that means is parts of Hemphill and parts of Wheeler have gained grassland productivity and have gained forage productivity. So we have more grass here than largely the rest of the Panhandle. If you look all the way up through the Central Plains, we have more grassland productivity right here and in eastern Oklahoma than most of the southern and central plains of the United States. What that means is you can read it as 15% more hay to 15 to 30% less hay depending on where you are, right? So if we think about the forage we need, if we have 30 to 15% less than what we typically have, then we would need 15 to 30% more hay or more supplement. 15 to 30% more forage means we got to feed less hay, right? Depending on where you are. What this does in the green and blue areas is provides you with a lot of more options at a very beneficial time, right? If you've got options and flexibility, as Andy said earlier, to try some creative marketing opportunities, there's some real opportunities for profit in the next year in some creative ways. The one thing I want to say before I dive into some of these methods is always talk to Andy, talk to whoever your county agent is if you're not from Hemphill. If you have to call Jason or Danny or myself, talk to them when making production decisions, particularly if you're not familiar with that production system. So if you've never held stockers, if you've never used implants, if you need help on that kind of stuff, talk to somebody who's done it before, and they can hopefully provide you with some research-based information that's going to help you adapt to that system in a profitable way. Because the worst thing we'd hate to happen is for you to make those adaptations, do them all wrong, and lose money on your expenditures, as well as just having to get the same prices for the calves that you got in the first place. But all of those forces coming together show us that we're at very strong steer calf prices. This is those 4 to 5 weight calves. This is in the Southern Plains. So this is Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas all combined. We're at an average of, I would say, $2.05 over the last month. It's very strong 4 to 5 weight prices. Very strong feeder calf size prices. So we're at that 7 to 8 weight calf size. More than $1.80, and I think last week in Texas, again, we were in the $1.90 range, if I remember correctly. So strong feeder calf prices. What this means is if you typically sell at weaning, we want to start thinking about, is my revenue from selling a 4-weight calf better than if I were to hold on to that calf with some of that extra forage that I've got? And is the additional weight gain going to compensate me for what I spend on keeping these calves to a heavier weight? We're going to talk about some of those options specifically here in a second. But then up here, what we've got is slaughter steer prices, right? So we're beginning to see some breakout from that seasonal pattern where we typically see a decline through this part of the year. What this is telling me is that people are bidding up the price of fed steers because there's not enough in the pipeline. And so we typically see the seasonal pattern bring us lower through the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. We're seeing it remain relatively flat and begin to increase, which means that contra-seasonal signal always tells us that the market is doing something unique. And anytime we have high slaughter steer prices, that derived demand goes back through the entire industry and increases feeder calf prices and increases wean calf prices. So what are our options given that we've seen higher prices and we see what our kind of production expectations are? This is a price outlook. If you guys want to take a picture of this series of prices is developed by David Anderson, who's our state livestock marketing economist. So he puts together a range of prices based on response to inventory. So his entire marketing model is based on how our inventory is changing and what do we expect that to do to prices in the next year to 3 years. I've also got the contracts as of last week. I'll tell you that every single time I put these contracts together to add into this table, they go up. At the beginning of the summer, when I was doing Q4 of this year, this was at like $1.68. So we've gained 15 cents in the last 3 to 4 months. And that's as the market, again, is beginning to realize we're not going to have enough at delivery time, and it's bidding that up. And so I think as we get further and further out here, we're going to continue to see these prices in particular begin to go up. I don't think this is the highest we're going to see, but keep those in mind. So let's talk about some options for calves in lieu of the fact that the rest of the country is in drought, or that you might be in drought, or that you might have some extra grass according to that grass cast map. So let's look at our weaned calf sales. So if you haven't sold yet, if you're still waiting and you're going to sell some weaned calves, that fall weaned calf sale, if we're thinking about that roughly $2.05 per pound price at about a 4.5 weight, it's going to net about $922 in revenue per head. So this is going to be our base, right? This is what we normally do. Let's think about overwintering stockers in lieu of weaned calf sales. So what we're going to do is we're going to retain some of those calves. We're going to grow them to a larger size, and we're going to sell them later, probably in the spring. This is probably a really attractive option for those of you who are in that I've got forage that's 15 to 30% greater than my historic average, right? I've got 15% to 30% additional biomass. I might not have to change what I'm doing other than separating those calves and weaning them to getting them into a stalker kind of operation. This is one in particular that I would think Jason would be someone to talk to you about those production decisions. But what is the outcome we expect to see in this case? So again, potential for 15 to 30% more biomass through the winter, so you can use that biomass. The other option would be to store it for the spring if you think we're going back into a drought. There is potential for that. If we sell that stalker calf in the spring, we're going to see a price of roughly $1.86. Let's say we sell it light at about 700 pounds instead of 750 or 800. That revenue generated there is $1,302. The question becomes, can you maintain those calves over that extra period for $380 a head? I'm doing 1302 minus 922. If we think that we can maintain those calves for less than $380 a head until sale, that is going to be a net profit on the enterprise decision, right? That's the basic math. We also obviously have to factor in the cost of those, and we're going to go over those decision tools at the end. But the question is, can we maintain those calves for $380 a head, or $3.80 a pound? You might also think about going a step further and retaining ownership through the feed yard. So let's look at sale of a fed calf of middle of 23 or late 23 at roughly $1.55 per pound. I think this is low. I think we will probably see this get closer to 60, if not 65, depending on whenever you sell a fed calf. Let's look at a 13 weight. That's going to generate about $2,015 in revenue. So the question becomes, right, from here to here, can I gain more revenue by retaining ownership than what I spend? And then if we look at the entire system, is it more beneficial for me to get out here, or stay all the way through and net the premiums for retained ownership? Keep in mind our expected cost of gain. I've got estimates of cash corn. This is estimates, $7.30. For delivery, we're probably going to be a little bit closer to $8, but over the next 6 to 8 months, if you locked in today, you'd be able to pay something about $7.30, including basis here on the high plains. Feed to gain, we're estimating a 6.1 to 1. That's going to leave us with a cost of gain of $1.13 if all of this is accurate. If we add in 50 cents here for extreme basis, we're going to be looking at something more like $1.30 to $1.35. What you need to know there is that the revenue generated per pound gain is $1.55. If we think about $1.13 up to $1.35, that's going to be a net gain on retaining ownership. For these numbers, that's a rough margin of 42 cents per pound of gain. So this is marginal revenue, this is marginal cost. This includes a markup for yardage. So with that 42 cents per pound of gain generated in terms of profit, what you have to go back and consider, is it worth your time, your effort, and your cash outlay in order to retain that ownership? There is risk involved here, right? But people like Donna and Tarleton are going to talk about different ways to mitigate that risk throughout the rest of the day if we want to think about insuring our pasture or insuring some of that feed or some of those calves into the long term. Because obviously there's risk involved if you own anything longer. But I think there's opportunity in both of these markets because the prices are going up. Now this is if you've got grass. If you are deficit in grass, it's time to start thinking a bit more creatively about where you can find value from culling and then replacing with this kind of system, or culling and replacing with some other types of cows. But first, real quick, what we want to talk about is ways to add value. Jason already covered some of this, but just keep in mind some of the simple ways that you can add value. Implants, some other processing options. Implants right here, the ROI is usually positive, and it's just going to increase, right? Every increase in value that we see for calf price is going to increase the value of those implants, because they're going to cost roughly the same, but every additional pound that they yield is going to be more valuable. If you're not in some kind of verified product program, you're not intentionally sending beef to the EU, you're very likely not getting that NHTC premium, even though you're not using implants if you don't use them. But what we can see is that the ROI on an implant for a 4.5 weight calf is about $4.50. So for every dollar you invest, you get about $4.50 back. Expect about 18 additional pounds. For those stocker sizes, I assume 20 to 40 additional pounds, an ROI of $7.50. This includes the need to re-implant them, so implanting them at the young age, and then also whenever they're going into your stocker program. This, again, keep in mind that if we're maintaining here at this point, that stocker is going to range from 30 to 58% of the cull cow weight. So anything we cull, we're going to be able to put on 1 or 2 additional, if not 2 or 3 additional stocker calves. So again, we got to start getting creative about what we're keeping and what we're selling. Other ways to process and add value: unweaned calves are selling at a significant discount right now. I had to redo these numbers this morning. I saw some bulls selling at a $157 per head discount when compared to steer calves. that sold at Will Dorado last week. So again, when thinking about the value that castrating has on these animals, that is something that you can do very inexpensively and add a whole lot of value, or not do and lose a whole lot of value. If we look in aggregate, if we leave $75 to $100 on the table here, and then we leave something like, let's say, what is that, 50 bucks on the table here or here, we're leaving in the neighborhood of $150 to $200 a head on the table if we don't take on these activities. And these are the things to talk to Jason or your AgriLife extension professionals about, and the things Jason and I will come out and help you with. Again, I'm just going to look pretty and hold the tools, but Jason will help you do the work. So keep these in mind whenever you're marketing those calves. One other thing on retaining ownership, the corn market's volatile. So again, Donna's going to talk to you about mitigating some of that risk. We're still seeing impacts from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and drought is impacting the Western Corn Belt. But if you have any thought that you might want to retain ownership, I'd seriously consider talking to Donna about mitigating some of those price moves now and trying to lock in some of your inputs if you think you might retain ownership. Here we go. He left. Of course. All right, well, y'all tell him that we talked about imports, right? So U.S. net beef imports, right? So net imports means how much are we exporting and how much are we importing combined. We have become a net exporter of beef. So anything below this line means we are in a net export that month. Anything above that line means we're a net import. You can see that our net imports are down significantly. That's largely a function of the fact that we're exporting a ton. We've had record-breaking exports of beef, so more than 1 billion pounds monthly for a couple of months now. We are also importing less. And so we're exporting our high-value cuts, we're importing our low-value cuts and trimmings, and that's largely what's influencing the pull-up in the value of calf prices, because we're exporting in that market. And even though we're seeing some competition from trim from other countries, we're seeing less and less, which is what's pulling up the value of cull cows. So very low supply of cull cows and of trimmings because of droughts in other parts of the world. And so this net import situation is what's yielding a lot of the market influences we're seeing today. That brings us to slaughter cow prices. Some of the highest slaughter cow prices we've seen in a decade, not necessarily record-breaking, but certainly very high. I would point out that we are moving into that seasonal decline. Now, I can't say that we're going to move seasonally. A lot of our other price patterns tell us we're moving contra-seasonally, but you can see that the seasonal pattern has still held relatively for the entire year. If we begin to move downward, this answers one question for me. People talk about maintaining open cows to try and access some of those premiums next year. Get rid of them. Jason may tell you something about finding another career for those animals. And I agree with him. Get rid of them. Whether they find another career as an accountant or as a hamburger, whatever they're finding a career as, I don't care. What I'd like to point out to you is we're going to lose value. The next time, seasonally, we expect you to get the same value you'd see today is out here in March. We're not going to get seasonally much higher than we are at right now. Now, this may change a little bit, right? We might see some contra-seasonal moves, but in general, we are not going to get much higher cull cow values than we have right now. And so the idea that you might hold an open animal to try and get a better price for her in the spring, it's not going to happen. You're not going to make back the money it costs to hold her, particularly if you've got a deficit of forage. So if you've got an open, get rid of her. If you've got a cow that you can market who has not been a great performer, whether you market her as an open, whether you market her as a bred or a pair, it's time to start thinking about a good career for her elsewhere too, right? Because we want to invest in our very high value assets that generate a lot of revenue over time. This is time to get, Jason has said it before, I think this is the first time I've said it, get more critical with your cows than you have ever been before, ever, because they're going to cost money, and it's very likely that we're going to see some dry conditions returning. So even if you've got that 50 to 30% buffer, we might lose it over the winter, right? So here's some options and outcomes for cows. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but please I will send these slides to Andy, and he can send them to anybody, or you can email me. I'll put my info up at the end. But these are some options and outcomes for cows today. So we've got hold, and then hold and sell in the spring. The idea here is, what is it going to cost you? So additional feed and other inputs. You're not going to gain anything. There's no price for that cow. The revenue, if we sold her in the spring, is about $780, which is about what we're seeing today. Probably even a little bit lower than what we see today. I've got her percent of weight of a cull cow out here. So the way to look at that is that a cull cow that we hold is 100% of a cull cow, right? And the reason I'm saying that is think about this in terms of how many additional of these units you can add if you get rid of a cull cow, right? Because you're not doing necessarily a 1-for-1 exchange. You may be doing a 1 for 2 or a 1 for 1.5 or something like that. But let's look, for example, at replacing a cull cow with a bred. So we've got heifers. This is market information from last week that were less than 2 years old in their first trimester. So that's on that side of that semicolon. So that side of the semicolon, that side of the semicolon. And then we've got cows, anywhere from 2 to 8 years old. What we're seeing in terms of what it would cost you is $1,000 for the heifer and anywhere from $850 to $1,300 for the cow, averaging about $1,000. What do you notice here to here? They're roughly the same, right? So again, if you have an open cow and you're thinking, I'm going to try and get more money for her as a cull in the spring, get rid of her, sell her, and if you just have to replace an animal unit on that grass, you can't stand to be understocked, get a bred, right? You can almost pay for, if not pay for, all of a bred heifer or cow with the revenue generated from the cull. And people say that they're not on the market. They are out there. They're available here. And if you need to truck them in from a little ways away, it's probably going to be worth your money, because anyone who's bred, think about those calf prices we talked about next year. So all these options would suggest that culling and then spending that cull revenue on most of replacing with an existing pair, all of a bred, or something like a heifer and a half or a heifer and a half is going to be incredibly valuable, right? So if you're not used to developing heifers for the replacement market, that's something that I would caution you to consider very carefully. If you're not used to conditioning heifers and getting them to a breeding weight, think twice about that. But if you're thinking about the possibility to buy a heifer who is at a larger size and that you're going to use to replace your cows, that's something worth consideration. But keep those production management decisions in mind. If we do go back into a drought, the animal that's the most likely to not breed is going to be that young heifer when we compare it to an older cow, right? So think about your production experience, what you're really good at, capitalize on that. If you're not used to growing heifers, buy some of those middle-aged cows, right? Get something that's going to get you a calf on the ground. So I've presented just a ton of information. The question now is what to do. I didn't give you any answers, right? I just said, here's a couple of options, and I didn't give you any answers. So what do we do? We've got a series of decision aids. Like I said, we've got around 150 decision tools and one overarching budget decision-making tool that you can plug things into that is going to help you in evaluating this with your own data. The first thing I got to say is you have to have your own data. If you're not collecting it and you're not using it, this is the time to start. And if you haven't collected it before and you're thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Call me. We'll figure something out. We've got some example data that we can work with from around the range. We can talk to Andy. We can talk to some of your neighbors and figure out roughly what it is that you spend and what you earn on an annual basis. If you haven't collected data, start now. And if you don't have it, we'll help you out. What I'm going to do here for the next couple of slides is tell you where to find the tool. We're going to talk about what the use is, and you'll see some kind of little image that talks about it a little bit. So to get the overarching large budget spreadsheet tool that helps you evaluate your entire herd, Google Texas AgriLife District 1 crop and livestock budgets, go to the link for spreadsheet budgets. You'll see a cow-calf link and a stalker link. It's going to pull up a spreadsheet that allows you to input all your own data, and it's going to help you see what your expected outcomes are. So all these red boxes are going to show you what your operation is doing. The solid white bars are telling you what we expect on the regional average. This is going to help you with a host of different decisions, but it's the foundation for decision making at the herd or ranch level. Unless you know how your entire operation normally functions, it's very hard to make those individual smaller level production decisions we're going to talk about on the next slide. So this is the place to start. We're going to go with the AgriLife cow, calf, and stalker budget spreadsheet tool. And again, Dee Dee Jones in our office, myself, Jason can do this, Poncho, our economist, and Vernon can do this. If you live in Oklahoma, We're happy to help you, and there's also extension economists in Oklahoma that will help you. Call someone and we'll help you put this together and begin to start using these to make decisions.
So Justin?
Yes.
One point I'd like to make on that, if you go, and Janet can probably articulate about this, if you go and speak with our best farmers in the Texas Panhandle, they started using these spreadsheets that we prepared through AgriLife Extension, how long ago, Danny? 15 or 20 years ago? Dr. Steve Amison did those things.
Yeah, we've been doing the cropping for a long time.
And cow-calf producers and stocker cattle operators particularly haven't been, mostly cow-calf producers. We've now got these tools, thanks to you and Jason and some others. And guys, I predict in the next 5 to 10 years, you won't do your cattle business without using this information. It's just that important. So please take advantage of this. It's free.
We certainly do hope that you'll use them. And one thing I'll point out is they're not free. Your taxes paid for these.
Well, that's true.
Right?
That is true.
So if you don't want the government to just keep your money, this is an opportunity for you to get something back out of those tax dollars, right? And jokes aside, they're free for you to download. You don't have to call me. You can go online and download these yourself and do them yourself if you want, but we will help you. We're paid to help you. Your taxes paid for me to help you and for Dee Dee to help you. So please call us if you need help, because we want to make sure that, as Andy said earlier, my family, we had a really small cattle operation, but we sold it all during the drought. We want to keep that from happening to you, right? So call us if you need help, but this is the overarching large-scale decision-making tool. Again, I've talked about a lot of specific production options, a lot of management options that we need to start evaluating. You'll search this website, you'll see this is the first thing you're gonna see. This particular page has a variety, over 115 specific decision analysis tools. So there's replacement heifer budgets. We talked about what do I want to do in terms of keeping heifers or replacing heifers. It's got a retained ownership decision tool. It's got a preconditioning profitability tool. There's many, many more tools on here. So what kind of replacement enterprise do I want to pursue? Do I want to look at AIing? Do I want to look at natural service? All of these different tools. And when I'm saying there's 115, you can scroll down and this would go all the way to China if we went through the floor. I mean, there's a huge number of tools on here. They were built by an accountant, not an economist, and I know this is going to sound crazy to y'all, but economists and accountants do not see the world the same way. We actually think that they're the weird ones. So some of these are a little complicated. They were built by, if any of you ever knew Jim McGran, he's a fantastic faculty member from our emeritus faculty, but he did build them as an accountant, and so they take into account things like taxes and stuff like that. But if you just want to evaluate it on a enterprise analysis, we can help you make them a little more simple. So again, call me if you need help. You can plug all of these tools in after you get the information out of here back into this larger budget. We also have a new drought management options tool. So I already mentioned Poncho and Vernon, but he's our Texas AgriLife Extension economist in Vernon. His email is ponchoabello@ag.tamu.edu as part of a drought management grant that me, Jason, Poncho, and Morgan Treadwell in San Angelo were on. He developed a very large decision-making tool for drought management, and it's going to be helpful for him to go through that tool with you because it goes down to month-to-month drought expectations, and you can aggregate that up to an annual change. And what he'll do is help you evaluate the expected outcomes for culling and leaving some forage on the ground for storage for next year, retaining on feed, so maybe we want to dry lot those cows or we want to retain some calves on feed for a longer period. Whether you want to maintain cows versus heifers, you can use this thing to evaluate just about any drought tangential decision that you could ever imagine. And you can do it on your own, but he's a consummate professional and very helpful, and he will help you put these things together. Are any of y'all in his peer group for grazing right now? I've got a couple in Poncho's peer group. He's fantastic. He's a better economist than I am, no joke. Like he knows his stuff. I don't know if he's ever told y'all that are in his group, but he managed a double-digit, multiple thousand-acre ranch and farm in Argentina before he came here. He knows his business very well. So let's talk about some takeaways briefly. I have far surpassed my time, but I'm going to blame Andy. Beef demand, strongest that it's been in history. Shrinking cow herd, so a loss of 2% of the cows, loss of 3% of the replacement heifers. We've lost our production engine. going to be a long time before we get back to calf levels that we've seen in the previous year. There's also an associated decline, just cyclically, but we expect it to extend because of the drought. That means record-breaking prices. Shrinking supply and strong demand leads to a huge increase in prices, and I expect potentially record-breaking prices. That does not include the potential for increased slaughter capacity. We've seen a bunch of projects announced around the country, including in Amarillo, that will increase the demand for fed cattle. If we see a sudden influx in demand for fed cattle through this increased slaughter capacity, you can expect this trend to stay in place more like 6 to 7 years. Because every additional head that they pull off of the fed market, they're competing for. And again, it's going to take us a couple of years to build the cow inventory to generate the fed calves they need to fill those plants. So it depends on how much slaughter capacity comes online, but it will induce an increase in prices over and above what we are already seeing. Opportunities. Expect increase in calf prices, potentially to record levels. Take every opportunity to add value to those weaned calves you already sell, right? You already are out there marketing weaned calves. There's an opportunity for you to increase the revenue generated. Nobody ever calls me unless, sorry, this is buzzing up here. No one ever calls me unless I'm in front of people. That's what Andy said earlier. I told you.
That's wrong. That is a joke.
Calf price is expected to increase, and so find ways to add value where you're not already doing so. So rather than rounding everybody up and taking them to the sale with horns on and completely intact, make sure that you are adding value where you can, and we will come help you do that. Think about overwintering stockers because there's going to be opportunity and the value is going up, and consider retained ownership through the feed yard. The cold market is strong as a function of demand for ground beef and a lack of imports. You missed the import discussion. You walked out at the wrong time. Entering seasonal decline for the cull cow market. If you've got an open, get rid of her now. Today is the time to get rid. Probably a week ago was the time, but get rid of those opens because you're not going to generate the premium in the spring. Excuse me, before I say it will be very difficult to generate the premium in the spring. It's going to compensate you for keeping her over winter. And when you sell her and you get roughly $1,000 this fall, think about, do you want to save her grass? Do you want to replace her with one of the variety of options I don't have listed out here, but includes pears, breads, some stockers maybe instead of cows? Remember, the current value of cull cows is going to compensate you for a lot of replacements of different varieties. That's what I've got today. I've gone about 10 minutes, 15 minutes over my time. Does anyone have any? Got a question right here. We got two. We'll go here first.
I got two. Do y'all have a chart on where people spend their money on 10 cents per gallon gas, down or up? Can you see where?
You say that one more time. I'm sorry.
Do y'all have a chart where you watch people, if the gas goes down 10 cents, where does that little savings go over here on the other side?
I think it means the consumer.
Yeah, that's a great question. Do we know if gas goes down where the rest of that money goes?
Or is that paying for gas they bought 2 months ago?
So we actually haven't seen. Another thing that's kind of weird about the economy right now, debt levels are at record lows for consumer debt. And so credit card debt is at record-breaking historic lows. So they're not paying off old debts. What we assume they're probably doing is moving back into some. The hard part of that is they're not balancing it with savings either. So we can see credit card debt like at the aggregate level. We can see the consumer savings rate. Neither are changing. So what that would suggest to me is that, and Dawn and I talked about this, if you go to the mall or you go to, this is one of the nerdiest things I've ever said in front of people. Sometimes I just go walk around the mall and the grocery store to see what people are buying because it's a really strong indicator of what people are doing with their money. You go to those shops, people are buying stuff. I mean, they are out there buying durable goods, and I don't know why. We think maybe if they think a recession is coming and they might lose their job, they're trying to buy things while they have some money. We don't really know why, but consumption of durable goods is still really strong. And so probably, we don't know specifically, but it's probably going to normal consumption. It's just extra money to go back out and spend. He's got two. We'll go back there and we'll come to you.
The Pro Farmer crop tour went out and inspected the corn crop, and they came back way lower than USDA expectations. Even with the shortage of calves, what's going to happen if corn goes to $10 or $11 a bushel? What will your calf crop bring in?
So any increase in the corn price does pressure feeder calves. I expect some near-term short pressure downward, but again, the supply and demand influence of just packer operation, because their incentive is to operate at full capacity for max profit. We'll still go back to seeing record-breaking prices. I mean, I seriously expect that. Jason has a comment real quick.
Just one thing to add that funnels back into this discussion of potentially hanging on to calves and adding some value to them. In the scenario where that plays out, feed yards are typically going to be more interested in buying heavy yearlings than they are in buying lightweight calves and feeding those calves for a very long period of time. Now, this part of the world, typically we're buying and feeding yearlings anyway. But that's going to put more support towards price for those heavier weight calves than it will on flyweights or five-weights.
So to that point again, every pound you put on grass is going to be a larger net gain. Who it's for is the question, but it's going to be a larger net gain on the economic value of that calf on pasture. It's going to outpace what you put on corn just because it's cheaper.
So I'm gonna make a comment on something that he hasn't spoken about, but I think is very important. Dr. Smith talked about genetics. And we've also, and I'm picking on Charles today because he's here, but Charles, we've sold a lot of packer bulls too, haven't we?
A lot of them.
A lot of them. And guys, I'm going to tell you that you're going to pay in the next 3 to 7 years record prices for your herd bull replacements. Record prices. You think $7,000 bulls are high, we're going to see $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 bulls. That's what we're going to see. So if you're thinking that you're going to have heifers to rebreed, if I were in your shoes, I'd be thinking about buying some bulls this year that are heifer bulls, especially if I was thinking about breeding some heifers, even if I didn't need them, because you're gonna need them down the line if you're gonna retain heifers. Heifer bulls are gonna be in short supply and high demand, and they're gonna be critical to the rebuilding of our cow herd. So I know there's some breeders here, and they didn't put me up to saying that, but I really think that's a big factor that we need to be thinking about.
That might be an ideal opportunity to consider utilizing some AI.
That's exactly
as
right.
well. If we haven't, but we've been thinking about it, that might be the opportunity to
Yep.
try that. We can help set
Yep.
those up to hopefully be successful.
And that evaluation tool, there is an AI evaluation tool on there as well. So
Exactly. And I want to tell you one other thing that's been in my mind about this too. We have been sold a bill of goods by some of the breed associations about milk. Higher numbers don't mean better cattle always. And when you start adding growth and you start looking at milk EPDs that are, and I'm just familiar with Angus, 30, 40 pound milk, that doesn't fit the Texas Panhandle. It just doesn't if you want to get your cows rebred. And so we need to be careful with that, so as we rebuild and we think about our genetics going forward, we really need to think about those milk EPDs in order to build a cow that fits our country a lot better for the years to come. That's something that we can correct and change that we haven't necessarily done in the past. So